I remember hearing over the scanner report of a gas explosion at the Trade Center, and the level of chatter over the scanner rising exponentially, and it was clearly so much more than a gas explosion.
It was more about the tones of voices than what they were actually saying is what sort of drew me in.
And our assignment editor, Colin, came around the desk and said, just so everyone knows, it looks like a small plane hit the World Trade Center. So we had a camera from, I believe, the Empire State Building. We focused it on the World Trade Center, and in fact, we could see that something had hit the building.
I was not thinking that it was a terrorist attack. I was assuming that it was a pilot who got lost, who had some sort of mechanical problem.
And you could hear the growing panic in the voices of the fire department and the police department. And once they heard that it was a small plane, somebody came on the air and said that was no small plane, and they started asking for help and backup right there. And it was that moment that 9/11 was on.
We saw the second plane. It looked to me like it was coming from Staten Island, and it was flying very, very low. And I says, oh my God, this is something. Tower 1 was already burning. And I saw the plane go out of sight, and it almost made a turn like a car. And the second building went up. We ran all the way there. And as I was standing there watching, we actually saw people coming out of the window. I remember seeing a red tie. Well, I didn't realize it was a tie, something red. And it was somebody wearing a red tie.
Both towers were burning by the time I got to the entrance of the World Trade Center on September 11th. The FDNY had set up the command center. It was a controlled but frantic and devastating scene. Firefighters were headed up. Some people above were jumping to their desks. I ran to the nearest payphone, called into the newsroom, and they put me on live with anchor Pat Kiernan. Here is how that call ended.
It's just coming down, Pat. It is just coming down.
Watch the right
it's
side.
Exploding.
The building is ripping apart.
It is billowing. Pat, the debris is flying. I'm going to run.
You drop the phone, and we all used phone booths then, and I heard thunkety, thunkety, thunk, thunk, thunk as the phone was hitting the metal base of the phone booth.
And all in a sudden, the floors were just breaking away, and everybody was just screaming and worried about you, where you were. I covered my eyes because I couldn't bear to watch it.
We were frozen in the control room. The crew, the technical crew, the editorial crew, we're just like, what is going on? We'd never experienced or witnessed anything like that.
We hope that Kristen was not in a position where she would have been injured by that, but the tower is literally crumbling into the streets of Manhattan there.
When that building came down and you were on the phone, and I remember getting you down there, and then we lost you on a phoner. Right there, my heart sunk. I thought I had absolutely killed you.
I remember at one point thinking that I had killed everybody by telling everybody to get as close as they could.
And you said, I got to go, and that's the last we heard of you for I think 20 or 30 minutes.
I just couldn't believe you were alive, because then we saw the plumes. So we have the visual of these plumes that are like worse than every horror movie you've ever seen, with real people, not extras, fleeing for their lives.
It was like a surreal scene out of a movie, like as if it was some kind of nuclear winter. When we got back to the station, I'll never forget it, just the way it looked. You were walking down the hall, you had one shoe missing, you had debris in your hair. I called down to see if you were okay. You said you were, but you were clearly not okay. You were in some kind of shock.
We got the first word that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers, and I was not thinking that it was a terrorist attack. I was assuming that it was a pilot who got lost, who had some sort of mechanical problem, and I was thinking little plane, not a jetliner. And it was a few minutes later when we had somebody on the telephone who said, I see a wheel from an airplane lying in the street, and it is a big wheel from a big airplane. And that's when we got the first sense that there was something more to this.
As I was walking in the door, Steve said, get in makeup and get on the set now. By the time I was seated, there was a second plane. And that was the moment of horror. I feel like I could feel the blood draining out of me. I was looking at it and thinking, I can see there's a hole in the middle. There are people who are never going to get down. Having seen literally the bowels of the World Trade Center and knowing how that building was built, it didn't even occur to me that they would come down.
There was one moment in the coverage when I found it really hard to keep my composure, and that's when I was talking to you.
It is billowing. Pat, the debris is flying. I'm going to run.
And you drop the phone.
And that's the last we heard of you for I think 20 or 30 minutes.
Then finally somebody said, "We have Kristen." But that was the one and only time I cried on the air.
Throughout the entire day, there was so much developing in this story because it wasn't just the moment of the terrorist attacks.
All the things are going through my head, like, you know, don't speculate, say what you know, say what you don't know, say what you're trying to find out. Like this sea change. It was everything in my whole life and worldview is divided in my head into before that moment and after.
With more than a dozen New York 1 employees very close to the World Trade Center when that first tower came down, September 11th posed extraordinary challenges for New York 1 co-founder Steve Paulus. As he directed the newsroom, he was wondering what had happened to some of his employees.
I was actually at home. I got a phone call from somebody here who said, turn on the TV. And I turned it on in time to see when the second plane hit. I took the taxi to work, and the one thing that I'll never forget is that as I was heading downtown to the New York 1 offices, fire engines were all heading in the same direction, heading south. And you could see in the firefighters the look on their faces. They knew they were going into something horrific. And that will stick with me forever. You know, we sent an army of people immediately downtown. What people don't remember is when the towers collapsed, no one knew what happened. And we thought, was it an explosion? Was it a bomb? The image of this cloud enveloping lower Manhattan and not knowing what was happening, it was the only time in my career I've ever felt that we sent people and they had died. I mean, it was horrifying. I remember our assignment editor just said, what do we do? And I said, listen, just make a list of everybody who's there. And as they check in, you know, check them off. And then maybe 45 minutes later, she said, everybody checked in. And it was like the most gratifying moment. The other indelible moment was when we heard the Pentagon had been hit, because I was in the control room and the assignment editor yelled, a plane just hit the Pentagon. And you just had this feeling of what the hell is going on here? I mean, this was a New York City story, now it was a national story, and when was it going to end? I mean, that was a frightening, crazy moment. The craziest thing about that day was late afternoon, number 7 World Trade collapsed. I mean, this was like a 60 or 70 story office tower that literally just fell down. And it was like nothing happened. And the one thing I'll say about 9/11 is news people like to reminisce, talk about stories, tell war stories. They don't talk about 9/11 that way, because what they saw was horrifying. We had probably 30 employees in Lower Manhattan that day. You know, it's a miracle they all came back.
One of Steve's first orders was to keep New York 1 on the air. It would be 14 days before we aired a commercial. Another critical decision was telling political reporter Andrew Kurtzman to find the mayor. Andrew tracked him down, and Mayor Giuliani used New York 1 as his vehicle for getting his message out. We will have more on that next time. Most political reporters were sleeping in on the morning of September 11th, knowing they would be working well into the night because there was a primary election. New York 1 senior political reporter Andrew Kurtzman was among them, until his mom woke him up with the news.
I mean, that morning began when my mother called me and told me to turn on the television set. And when I realized what had happened, I immediately called New York 1, and the assignment desk, you know, they were going crazy. And I said, what do I do? What do I do? Where do you want me? And someone yelled to Steve Paulus, the general manager, where should Kurtzman go? And he thought for a second and said, tell him to find the mayor. I remember holding up my press pass to the cab driver, as if this, you know, was some magical shield that would prevent us, you know, keep us out of danger. And I said, get me down to the Trade Center. And I just kind of intimidated him into getting us down there until he came to his senses and slammed on the brake at, you know, Chambers Street and said, get out of my cab. And I was left alone on Chambers Street, which at that point was filled with kind of white dust. There was a policeman who screamed at me to get off the street. He said, get off the street, it's gonna blow. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm a reporter. I held up my press pass. I said, I need to find Giuliani. And he said, Giuliani is right there. And so I walked a block, and there was Rudy Giuliani covered in soot with Tom Von Essen, the fire commissioner, and Bernie Kerik, the police commissioner. And Giuliani said, "Come on, Andrew," and he had to locate or relocate City Hall. And we started going north, and suddenly Tower 2 came down. And it was basically right behind us, and it was this massive explosion, and there's this huge mushroom cloud that started chasing us. And Giuliani said, "Let's go," and we booked up Church Street. A plainclothes detective threw his arm around Giuliani to protect him, and we had to kind of run ahead of this mushroom cloud.
Together, they all ran for safety as the second tower collapsed, and Giuliani tried to figure out the city's next steps.
We ran ahead of this explosion and started looking for a new place to relocate city government. We first went into the Tribeca Grand Hotel, which was this kind of surreal moment because it's this awfully trendy place, and there were a ton of tourists who were oblivious to what was happening. And here we were covered in dust and this traumatic situation. And Giuliani looked around and thought there was too much glass around in case there was some kind of issue with another explosion. So this little nomadic tribe left the hotel and continued further up Church Street. He was the calmest one in the bunch. And he was just kind of very calmly giving out orders, wanted everyone to move north. And I had a microphone, and I said, "Mr. Mayor, talk to New York." And he just grabbed the microphone, and he just urged New Yorkers to stay out of the area. That's all he really wanted to communicate.
If you're below Canal Street, you should walk out of southern Manhattan and walk north, as these people are doing right here.
We walked up Church Street, this kind of nomadic tribe, and finally found this locked door at a firehouse. And one of Giuliani's detectives took out his gun to shoot the lock, and everyone said, "Don't do it, don't do it." Somehow they found a crowbar and opened the lock, and we made it into the firehouse. And little did we know that everyone in that firehouse was down at the Trade Center and didn't make it.
I don't know that I'm really able to describe it. It was the most horrific scene I've ever seen in my whole life.
It was a portrait of leadership, of kind of calm under fire. And it made an indelible impression upon me. It was the worst attack on the United States in history. And here was a man who was basically in charge of kind of keeping things together, and he excelled at it.
Andrew says one moment that will stay with him is Mayor Giuliani reaching out to a frightened young policewoman, gently touching her face and telling her they'd all be okay. He said, whatever you think of Rudy Giuliani, in those months after the terror attacks, he was the leader the city and country needed him to be. Kristen Shaughnessy, New York 1.